Hello and welcome to BBC News from me, Alistair Yates. After 49 years under Fidel Castro, Cuba has a new president. Unsurprisingly, the National Assembly has selected his brother Raul, who led the caretaker administration for the last 19 months. In his inauguration speech, Raul Castro said the Cuban government would continue to consult Fidel on major policy issues. From Havana, Michael Voss reports.
Raul Castro Rus.
Raul Castro has been confirmed as the new president of Cuba. The nominations and voting took place behind closed doors. The result was broadcast live on state television. It's understood that Fidel Castro's brother was the only candidate and that the vote was unanimous. But his choice of first vice president has come as a major shock. There had been talk of one of the younger generation of communist leaders stepping in. Instead, Raul has picked Machado Ventura, a 78-year-old hardline Politburo member and one of the original leaders of the revolution, as his number two. What this means for the prospects for change remains unclear. The last time there was a change of president here, a young Fidel Castro led his rebel army into Havana and the American-backed dictator Batista fled to Florida. Raul Castro was part of that rebel army and constitutionally he's been the heir to the throne ever since. He's the world's longest-serving defense minister and has the support of Cuba's powerful military machine. Raul was a Communist Party member long before Fidel, but is more of a pragmatist than ideologue. He has none of his elder brother's charisma, though his reputation is for getting things done. Raul Castro inherits a Caribbean island with impressive health and education systems, but a stagnant state-run economy. He's raised expectations that economic changes are on the way. He's also offered to sit down at the negotiating table with the United States, which continues to impose its decades-old trade embargo. But there are no indications that any major political reforms are being planned in this one-party state. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana.
Well, more now on the inauguration of Cuba's new president. Frank Carlson is from the Center for Free Cuba, which campaigns, it says, for a transition to democracy in Cuba. He says the current political regime in Cuba remains very much in place.
Well, the only place where there was a campaign among various candidates was in the foreign media. Whenever we talked to Cuba in the last few days, we've been saying that in Cuba everyone was basically saying Raul will take over, and that's the way it was. Major change in Cuba is that the vice president selected is another military leader, Machado Ventura, who's 77 years old. I guess the Cuban Revolution is echoing the same kind of procedure that took place in the Soviet Union toward the end. All the leaders are very old, and they're all the way back to the Sierra Maestra days. They're not going to change.
What about on the ground there? What sort of information filters its way through to your group about the people there and how they're feeling?
Well, most Cubans, the way I see it, and by listening to the calls and other means of communication, didn't think it was that significant. Most of the interest was generated outside Cuba. The Cubans knew that Castro had given up power, allegedly, 19 months ago. The Cubans also know that until 1976, Castro was not the president of Cuba, but he ran Cuba. There were two men that were present, President Urrutia and President Ortiz. So having the title in Cuba or in the Dominican Republic or in the Stalinist Russia didn't make any difference. Raul said today, General Raul Castro, that he will continue to consult with Fidel. What that really means for Cubans is that Fidel will continue to run Cuba behind the scenes.
Again, in terms of the feelings of the people there in Cuba, though, I mean, do you sense that they're unhappy about their lot? Although, I mean, I'm thinking, you know, after 50 years of sanctions against Cuba, they have failed to crush Castro. The people are still living there. What sort of messages are you getting?
Yeah, for some reason, again, there's a Cuba that has nothing to do with Cuba. It's a Cuba in the imagination of foreigners. This whole idea of 50 years of sanctions, the United States sells hundreds of millions of dollars to Cuba today. The issue is not the sanctions, the issue is not the United States, the issue is freedom in Cuba, and that's the way the Cubans see it.
Frank Calzon talking to me earlier.
Cuba is keeping it in the family. Raul Castro is replacing his elder brother Fidel as the country's president and vowing to continue his revolution. The decision by the National Assembly had been expected. But there is one surprise. The new leader is making a 78-year-old hardline communist his deputy. Raul's also insisting that although his brother is now out of the political spotlight, he'll be consulted on all major policy issues. From Havana, here's Michael Voss.
Raúl Castro Rus.
Raul Castro acknowledged his supporters when, as widely expected, he was confirmed as the new president of Cuba. But as the names of his inner cabinet, the Council of State, were read out, the one big surprise of the day, there had been talk of one of the younger generation of communists being promoted. Instead, Raul picked Machado Ventura, a 77-year-old hardline Politburo member, as his second-in-command. And in his televised address to the nation, Raul Castro announced that he'd continue to consult with his brother Fidel on all major policy issues.
El compañero Fidel Castro Rus.
So the deputies headed back to their constituencies, knowing they'd accomplished something many outside Cuba thought would never happen, a peaceful change of power. The last time there was a change of president here was in 1959, when a young Fidel Castro led his rebel army into Havana and the American-backed dictator jumped on a plane and fled to Florida. This time it's been a smooth transition. Raul Castro has raised expectations that economic changes are on the way, but there are no signs of any political reforms being planned to this one-party state. Most of the Cubans relaxing on Havana's seafront promenade, the Malecon, were born after the revolution and have only known one leader and one way of life. We've been happy for the past 49 years with Fidel in charge, this woman told me. I'm sure everything will be okay with Raul too, she added. It's the end of an era for this communist island in the Caribbean, yet much, it seems, remains the same. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana.
You're with World News Today. I'm Philippa Thomas. Now, as widely expected, power in Cuba has passed from Castro to Castro, from Fidel to Raul, from an 81-year-old to his younger 76-year-old brother. Raul, the world's longest-serving defense minister, was anointed by Cuba's National Assembly on Sunday. Here in the US, the response was lukewarm. The administration said this offers the potential for change. So what kind of change might the new Castro regime offer? Well, from Havana, here's Michael Voss.
There were long queues at newspaper stands in Havana on Monday as Cubans tried to work out what the new administration means. Raul Castro has promised economic reforms but urged patience once again. There had been talk of promoting a younger generation of communists, but it hasn't happened. Raul has surrounded himself with the old guard.
Me permita continuar.
Continuity is the name of the game. And in his speech, Raul Castro announced that he'll continue to consult his brother Fidel on all major issues. The challenge facing Raul Castro is how to manage change while preventing Cuba going the way of the Soviet Union. There, a political loosening saw the whole system collapse. In China, the Communist Party remains firmly in control, but the Cubans are concerned that the economic miracle there has created too big a gap between rich and poor. Raul Castro's hoping that a little less bureaucracy and state control will be enough to improve living standards and keep the system intact. Americans can't visit Cuba, but Canadian and European tourists do. They're warmly welcomed, but people resent the fact that there's one currency for foreigners, another for Cubans. Locals are also banned from entering tourist hotels and must have permission to travel abroad. Raul has announced that some restrictions could be lifted in a matter of weeks. Most of the Cubans relaxing on Havana's seafront promenade, the Malecon, were born after the revolution and have only known one leader and one way of life. We've been happy for the past 49 years with Fidel in charge. I'm sure everything will be okay with Raul, this woman told me. The change this man wants is for the US to lift its trade embargo. But that's not going to happen soon. The Bush administration said Monday that democratic reforms are needed for the embargo to be lifted. It may be the end of an era for this communist island in the Caribbean, yet much, it seems, remains the same. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana. Bureau member and one of the original leaders of the revolution as his number 2. What this means for the prospects for change remains unclear. The last time there was a change of president here, a young Fidel Castro led his rebel army into Havana and the vote was unanimous. But his choice of first vice president has come as a major shock. There had been talk of one of the younger generation of communist leaders stepping in. Instead, Raul has picked Machado Ventura, a 78-year-old hardline politician.
In his inauguration speech, Raul Castro said the Cuban government would continue to consult Fidel on major policy issues. From Havana, Michael Voss reports.
Raúl Castro Rus.
Raul.
Hello and welcome to BBC News from me, Alistair Yates. After 49 years under Fidel Castro, Cuba has a new president. Unsurprisingly, the National Assembly has selected his brother Raul, who led the caretaker administration for the last 19 months.
Castro has been confirmed as the new president of Cuba. The nominations and voting took place behind closed doors. The result was broadcast live on state television. It's understood that Fidel Castro's brother was the only candidate and that the